So tonight we're joined by Ray Jackendoff, who is a linguist, a cognitive scientist at Tufts University. Ray is here at the Center for Cognitive Science, and he gave a talk today. Ray has been doing some really impressive work in linguistics, but also in a much broader sense. You've worked, Ray, on music, you've worked on questions of consciousness, how language relates to the rest of cognition. You have a long list of accomplishments and awards and books and papers, and instead of reading this, I think... Scary. I thought that I would read something that Steve Pinker said about you. This is the back cover of your latest book, which I really enjoyed, by the way. You sent me a copy. That was very kind. It's called A User's Guide to Thought and Meaning. And on the back cover, Steven Pinker wrote the following. He said, Ray Jackendoff is a monumental scholar in linguistics who, more than any scholar alive today, has shown how language can serve as a window into human nature. Combining theoretical depth with a love of revealing detail, Jackendoff illuminates human reason and consciousness in startling and insightful ways. I think it's a very nice accolade here from Steve Pinker. So indeed today you gave a talk in which there was certainly theoretical depth and a lot of details as well. And in that talk you took issue, Ray, with some pretty fundamental and basic assumptions, conclusions that people in mainstream generally linguistics have taken for granted. For example, the fact that we should distinguish between a lexicon, a sort of mental dictionary, and a grammar, a set of rules to combine these words, and a few other distinctions. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about what people have traditionally assumed in this field and what your views are with respect to these questions.
That's hard to sum up in a few words,
right?
But I will give it a shot. I think that the tradition in linguistic theory has followed the tradition in old-time traditional grammar, that you write a dictionary that gives you all the words, and then you write a grammar that tells you how sentences work and phrases work, and they're in different parts of the book, or separate books, and their format is entirely different. And that goes back in traditional grammar, I believe, to Mark Aronoff, I think, said it goes back to the 17th century or something, like when people started writing grammars.
Yeah.
Right? And that was adopted, I think, uncritically by theoretical linguistics in our tradition. The emphasis in the generative tradition has been on how it's Humboldt's phrase from 1836, how one creates infinite use of finite means, right? So how we create novel sentences that we've never heard before, so that means the human language capacity can't be just memorizing sentences.
And that's been a pretty central insight and property of language that people like. Yeah,
and now Berwick and Chomsky call this the basic principle
right, that's right.
of language, something like that.
Yeah.
Sacred.
Yeah.
What goes with that is that the lexicon is all where all the exceptions go, and the grammar is where all the regularities are. Now, if you start probing at all the stuff in between, you find there's a huge amount of stuff in between that's patterned, but the patterns aren't regular, or the patterns, if you describe the pattern, it doesn't tell you about all the individual words because they have peculiarities in them, and so forth. And it turns out there's a whole continuum of things between rule-like behavior and totally idiosyncratic behavior. And in the formalism that Jenny Aldring and I have been developing in this newest work on morphology, we've been struggling with it now for almost 5 years, the idea is that we can actually express this continuum, that there are things that are more word-like, there are things that are more rule-like, and in between there are all kinds of things. And so what we've ended up doing, for a variety of reasons, but one of them is getting this continuum, is to say, Well, the rules are actually not in terms of producing sentences actively. That's also been a dogma of
Right.
generative linguistics, and I think it comes from traditional grammar too. If you read Grammars of Morphology, they say you stick an S on the end to get the plural,
Right,
you stick an ish on the end to get childish.
Right.
You see, right?
Right.
It's sticking things together as a procedure.
Exactly, yeah.
Um,
I'm thinking, for example, of Steve Pinker's book Words and Rules, which is
yeah.
all about this distinction.
Right,
And,
there's this
right,
strict dichotomy.
Right, dichotomy, yeah.
So if it's at all idiosyncratic, it belongs in the lexicon.
Right.
And if it
Productive,
passes the test of being productive, it's
then
in
it's
the
in the
grammar.
syntax and the grammar, right?
And they're really separate mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found was we were was rephrasing rules, if you like, reconceiving rules in terms of schemas, which are just templates for building structure.
Mm-hmm.
And the templates are in the same format as words. Mm-hmm. So a word is a collection of a piece of phonology, a piece of syntax, and a piece of meaning, mm-hmm. collected by some sort of binding them together.
Right.
And a schema is also a piece of semantics. It says, here's what this pattern means. So the plural is now something that semantically pluralizes some entity. Mm-hmm. Syntactically, it's changing an inflectional feature on the noun from singular to plural. Mm-hmm. Phonologically, it's an S tacked onto whatever the noun means. Mm-hmm. So it has all three levels, but some of the material in them are variables. So the variables say you can fill this with. So
by variables means the x and y's, things like that. Things that take different values for.
Yeah. So you can say plural is the plural of it's a function over some entity. Mm-hmm. In the morphosyntax, it's an affix attached to a noun. In the phonology, it's whatever that noun, however that noun is pronounced. That's the variable. Right. And plus an S. So it turns out that the schemas are just like words, except they have variables in them. And now we can play with the amount of variables and the amount of constant material and capture all kinds of different patterns that way.
And different aspects of that continuum that you were alluding to earlier.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, before you came up with these new ideas and started to look at the a larger segment or portion of that continuum, how were these gray areas dealt with by traditional theories? Were they ignored? Were they swept under the rug?
Yes.
Were they sort of...
You've got it.
Okay,
I mean,
that's better.
I mean, it's hard to sum up all the different frameworks going on, but some of them just ignored the differences between them. Right. Many of them, Chomsky in 1970 confronted this problem in his paper Remarks on Nominalizations. He said, well, all the idiosyncratic stuff goes in the lexicon, and it's accounted for by lexical redundancy rules, which were never really characterized. I mean, they're in the sound pattern of English as well.
And the focus, I take it, was on the productive aspect, and the grammar, and the lexicon was something that...
Well, it was
at least for Chomsky's...
He developed this idea of the lexical redundancy rules. He mentioned them. After that paper, he never mentioned the lexicon again, which I only recently learned is very frequently cited. It was like the 12th most cited article in Language or something.
That's pretty impressive.
I had no idea. I thought nobody ever read this paper. It's so crazy. Right? But I was trying to work out lexical redundancy rules, and I got to a certain point, and it just seemed so weird because I was thinking, well, phrase structure rules are used as lexical redundancy rules, and that doesn't make any sense. So I dropped it. I said, this can't be right. But now with this machinery of schemas, we can actually express it in a way that we couldn't before in the sort of productive procedural notion of rules, which I was adopting because that's what you did. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I couldn't make any sense of it. But now with this idea of schemas, which has grown out of a number of traditions, LFG and HPSG and construction grammar, all have declarative rules rather than procedural rules. So that was a nice model. The odd thing is that in HPSG and LFG, they said, well, we're still going to make this distinction between grammar and lexicon, where the lexicon manipulates all the words before it puts them in the syntactic tree, and then we do the inflection at the end.
I see.
Right?
Yeah.
So this came to be lexical integrity in various theories, right? Also in morphological theories. So
I'm
they're
curious,
still making that distinction. Construction grammar actually has broken that down and said, well, words and constructions, they're the same kind of thing. So we're more in tune with that.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
That conception.
So from a sort of broader scientific perspective of sort of theory formation, would you say that one of the advantages of this model is that it allows you to capture a broader swath of the empirical data, and that's always desirable, of course, right? If your theories can explain more stuff, then everything else being equal, that's of course an advantage, right? Yeah.
Right. So I mean, to be able to talk about this continuum, and all of them sort of fit in one way or another. There are plenty of things we still have to work on.
Of course, yeah.
But I've always been attracted to these things somewhere in the middle that are kind of weird. Those are really going to tell us what's going on.
Right.
But to find the right vocabulary to lay them out and actually formalize them has been a long trek.
So in your talk, you alluded to the fact that this new conceptual view of language is also going to allow you to talk and to think in a better way about questions of language acquisition, which have been central also in this program, and also more psychological questions, if we can put it this way, of how language is processed in real time. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you see this model as an improvement for dealing with those questions compared to the earlier models.
Well, the earlier or contemporary.
Or contemporary.
Right, for that matter.
Earlier, before your work, let's say.
Well, except I've been doing it for 20 years, so
fair enough.
I mean, it's not like this is brand new, although I think it's in a new degree of richness that it had not achieved before.
I'll ask you in a few moments how people have reacted to it, but before we get there,
so one of the problems with this traditional way of doing things is you say, well, you start in the old days, you start with S, with the sentence, and you expand it and you put in the words at the end, and now you start moving things around. And this is profoundly at odds with what any notion of language processing could be like. Right? And they told us in graduate school, it's not like you start with S and then you build the sentence and then you decide what to say and how to pronounce it, right? By sending it off to the other, to phonology and semantics. Nevertheless, the theory has persisted in doing things that way. You start with merge now. You start at the bottom instead of the top. You merge things in. You gradually build your tree. You send things off to semantic interpretation and to spell out, and so the syntax is still governing the structure, and everything else is read off of it. That can't be a model of processing,
right?
Because you want to say in processing, well, you start in comprehension with phonology, and you're constructing semantics
all the way to meaning, right?
All the way to meaning, and in production, the other year some concept you want to
express, and then you all the way to phonology.
Right. So you want something that's non-directional.
So what were the motivations back then? If I think it was understood pretty early on with this notion of the derivational complexity that it was not really psychologically very plausible.
Well, at the beginning it was.
Well, until
people started
doing experiments and finding out that it doesn't quite work that way.
And the reaction on the part of the generative grammarians, led by Chomsky, but everybody bought into it, to say, well, we're talking about competence, and that has no particular bearing on performance. Performance can't provide evidence for the theory of competence. When we talk about moving things around, it's metaphorical and moving. And nobody ever asked metaphorical for what, right? Whereas if you do things in terms of templates or schemas, you can say, well, here's a piece of structure you have available to you. It's stored in the lexicon. You pull it out when you need it, combine it with other things. And it doesn't matter whether you're cued into pulling this out on the basis of its meaning or on the basis of its phonology or on, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
So one of the other things you said in your talk at the beginning is that this notion that we just touched on of competence versus performance now is going to be either collapsed in your new model or rethought, or what's...
It's rethought in the sense that the theory of the representations, which is competence, say here are the possible representations for the language. This is the knowledge. This is the speaker's knowledge of language. You can drop that into a processing theory directly. You can say what happens to the representations. How do you recruit schemas? It's the same way as the way you recruit words. Just as you plug a direct object into a verb that's transitive, you plug things into variables in more abstract schemas and so on. So, and the same for acquisition. You can say it's not the child gets some words and on the basis of that constructs a structure over here. It's that the child is gradually adding new lexical items with variables in them where things that are detected to be similar, you find a bunch of things that are the same, and where the differences are, you put a variable. So you can see that now you have to ask exactly the same questions about acquisition as you always do, but it's now making contact with the formal theory. So you can say, how would the representation? You can say, how would it have to work? Now you can ask, how do you implement that in developmentally?
So I can see this bringing these two notions closer together. Your theory of competence and how things actually happen, either are acquired or processed. I'm wondering if you've thought about whether this new approach also makes empirical predictions, perhaps, about, say, the acquisition process or processing in adults that perhaps weren't made by the other model, or might differ from. Is it something you thought about already?
A bit. I mean, we looked a lot at the lexical access literature, and it's bewildering.
It's a big literature, right?
But one of the things that we looked at was, so when you look at morphologically complex words, do you decompose them or do you whole words? And say both are available to you in your lexicon. You can either use the schemas to take things apart or integrate together, or you can store the whole word, and it sort of doesn't matter. So the question, so now you can say, well, when is it more useful, or when does one operate faster than the other, or if they arrive at the same solution, then they should reinforce each other and should go even faster. So we thought about words that are probably novel, that have to be decomposed. So something like purpleness is probably not a word we store away, but you can understand it right away because ness is productive. A word like scrumptious, where you probably pick off the affix and you're left with a piece of junk. So that should be harder to process than something but easier to process than something like crocodile that has no schemas that are invoked. Okay, so scrumptious invokes you can't totally decompose it, but you say, oh, I know that affix, as opposed to something where both things work out, like I don't know, childish or something, where it's totally transparent and you know both parts.
That's right.
And you can do it both ways at the same time.
That's very interesting. So back to this question of competence and performance. I used to do a lot of experimental work in language acquisition, and it's an issue that came up very often. Perhaps not in the same sense as it was traditionally thought about in linguistic theory, but you would get a child behaving a certain way in an experiment. And often you would have a deviation from what you would expect or find adults to do in the same experiment. And then the question was always why. So why questions, why we see what we're seeing. And one possibility, of course, is that there's a piece of grammar that is missing or that's not acquired yet, and so that would be sort of a competence type of account. Or maybe there's something about the experiment or the context or something that the child didn't get. And so do you think that it's useful to preserve this distinction, at least in the context of trying to make inferences from the result of experiments to whether, or does your approach have anything perhaps to say or some light to shed about this? I mean, it's actually a pretty important problem in
How-
language acquisition, I think.
So I sort of lost
Oh,
what
yeah.
the question was. Try again, please.
Well, so if there's one area where the competence performance distinction
Yeah.
is still made, it's in some area of
Oh, I
language
see.
acquisition, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because you
Right.
want to, and people differ quite a lot in how they interpret
okay.
those, right? Yeah. So
Right.
I'm wondering if your new take on what that distinction is or should be
Mhm.
would have any bearing on those kinds of questions.
Well, one of the things that we are doing is saying in sort of storage of lexical items, things will be stored with a certain resting activation or some
Right.
other measure of lexical strength
Right.
that everybody correlates with frequency. I mean, almost everybody agrees on that. And there are questions about what the function is like
Sure.
and so forth. But now you can say under what conditions is a schema available based on its strength. So schemas will have resting activation the same as words. And they will be pumped up by any instance of that schema. So now you can say, well, at what point can you say the child has the rule?
Right.
It might have been growing, but not enough to be useful at that point. So you can
that's
get some
great.
gradient things
Yeah.
rather
Okay,
than
so this,
instantaneous.
okay, or
Right.
so it will take us away from this dichotomy,
Yeah.
which I think has been what people have been talking about in terms of either they have it or they don't.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
And but sometimes I've seen in a single experiment, you see kids flipping back and forth.
Okay.
Right. So it looks on some trial, it looks like they have it.
Uh-huh.
On other trials, it looks that they don't. So go ahead.
Yeah. This brings to mind a sort of a speculation I've had that you don't want to just talk about resting activation, boom, as a number. You want it to be the center of a distribution that is stochastic, because the brain is a noisy computational environment.
Yeah.
What that means is the weaker thing doesn't always lose. There will be occasions when, just when you need it, it happens to be a higher level than the strong one. Yeah. And you need that so that, and somebody told me this was said a long time ago by, I don't know, Lashley or somebody like that. This is why even an expert bowler cannot hit 300 every time. Why an expert basketball player in the NBA can't hit a free throw every time, right?
Because of the noise?
Because of the noise,
yeah.
right? It's unavoidable. And what your practicing does is cut the noise down,
okay.
but it's unavoidable in the end. So variability now in behavior can come out of this processing theory. It's a theory of what's going on with the representations, their strength. That's not really the business of the competence theory, but it's saying how do you get these things in here and how do they operate in the context. So, but the fact that the rules are in there with the words means that they too are playing a role. Yeah.
So it's going to bring theories of processing and acquisition also closer together.
That's right.
Which is desirable.
Right. So what's going on in the child's processing as learning is taking place. Right.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, very interesting. So I want to ask you now,
Right.
moving on to, so you've told us that you've been developing these ideas for over a decade now, right? But that you've hit a new sort of high, maybe, where they've become more productive, shall we say?
Yeah.
What's the reception been, especially since you're challenging some pretty core assumptions?
I would say there's no nominal. I mean, I feel like I'm ignored.
I see.
I hate to say this in a public forum like this, but I published an article in Language in 2011 that really compared very judiciously and fairly, I think, the differences between the parallel architecture approach and minimalism biolinguistics. And I thought, well, this will get some dialogue going. There'll be some good fights like the old days, you know. Nobody responded to it. It was just like it didn't exist.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess that's a strategy, right? Sort of not even engaged.
You know, they always say it's better to be hated than ignored.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Okay, yeah, go ahead.
At the same time, I mean, I gather people are reading this stuff. People read Foundations of Language.
Yeah,
It gets cited a lot.
Yeah.
They give me awards for it,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
But I think the psycholinguists are more impressed with it than the linguists.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you, so outside of linguistic circles, say in psychology or psycholinguistics, or even in cognitive science more broadly, has the reception been different?
I think it's, people say this is really interesting.
I see.
But, why do I need to change my whole life's work in order to, accommodate a new theory? And I think at the moment, the field is tired of new theories.
Mm-hmm.
Another theory, everybody has their own theory. Why should I pay attention? There are too many theories around here already.
Yeah.
And that's part of the life cycle of a field, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, we could talk more about this, but so I wanted to ask you also how you see these new ideas fitting within the broader context. So the role of language or the place of language within cognitive science in general and within the rest of mental architecture now with these new ideas, but also what's your take on what that role has been in the past?
It was supposed to be this alliance of psychology, computer science, philosophy, and linguistics. And and Sloan Foundation threw us all together, and we were supposed to talk to each other, and we did talk to each other. And as the community grew, I think people sort of retreated into their specialties more. And my impression is, and then neuroscience came along, brain imaging, and that was just a whole huge influence on the way people thought. And so now, if you read the journal of cognitive science, there's a lot of fMRIs in it, and ERPs in it, and it's all about and genetics and all this kind of stuff. And linguistics, which focused on the nature of the representations, was really, I think, left out in the cold.
So as things progressed,
and the linguists, I think, also, because of the competence performance distinction, was so ingrained, and because the theories of the time were not so oriented towards psychology. My feeling is that linguistics kind of got isolated from the rest of the cognitive sciences. So the only place that I know of where there were real theories of representation were, one, the work I did with Fred Laerdal on music, and two, David Marr.
Often cited for,
often cited. Though he's mostly cited for his three levels of inquiry.
The computational, algorithmic, and physical.
And after, it's unfortunate that he died just at the point when it was taking off. Because people in psychology said, well, there are problems with his representations, it doesn't work that way. And the theories that came up to replace it were all kind of primitive. I think by comparison, they didn't have the same sophistication and address the same issues.
So there's a bit of a paradox here, it seems, because on the one hand, the sort of standard story you hear is that the study of language helped really launch.
I think it did.
The cognitive revolution.
I think,
And at the same time, what I'm hearing you say now is that as that unfolded, then language sort of took a back seat, and people went back in their different. So if we look forward now at the future, what are your thoughts on the future of linguistics within the cognitive sciences, given sort of its?
That depends on who is aggressive about what. I mean, I don't know
how would you like to see?
What I would like to see.
What would you like to see?
What I would like to see is that this kind of work would inspire people to reach out. I mean, and both in linguistics and in the other aspects of psychology. I mean, so if we can say this theory of the lexicon is really a theory of memory, and here's all this structure that is in the lexicon, is that just a fact about language, or is that a fact about the brain?
Or memory, or what aspects
memory,
you derive.
So, we've taken a little sideways look at some of the domains, and we can say, look, we can find. People were talking about schemas back in the 80s. There's a nice article by Dave Rumelhart before he became a connectionist, where he's talking about schemas are everything. There's schemas for face recognition and schemas for, I don't know, houses and schemas for airports. And Shank was writing about schemas for, he called them scripts, right, for restaurants. And Minsky was writing about the frame for birthday parties.
Right.
And those were all on the right track, but nobody knew how to formalize them, and they couldn't write computer programs. Right. And so I think Rumelhart said, somebody told me this, that basically that Rumelhart said, I don't know how to program this, let's go back to basics, and he became a connectionist, right? And it's, really get down to the nitty-gritty. But if we look at, the social domain and the navigation domain and the music domain and all these things, we might be able to actually construct a theory of memory in terms of the different, so they have different representations in these domains, but it's the same kinds of links in the network.
Yeah, that's one thing that really impressed me about your book is how many other areas you touched on, and not just superficially, but you said something I think important about how spatial visual representations would. Well, you started your talk by saying, "Hey, we are able to talk about what we see." How does that happen? You've said things about consciousness that I found very, very interesting, and many other areas, right? So what you'd like to see then is people sort of engage with this more and do work that take these ideas seriously and work out the details, maybe in if you're doing work on memory or work on visual. So true interdisciplinarity. Where
even to just ask, what are the things that, I mean, this is Morris, what are the things that this level has to be able to do?
Right.
So if you want a level that has to do with shape, for example, you have to be able to say, this is suitable not just for vision, but you have to be able to feel the shape of objects. You can even feel the shape of pills in your mouth, right? So what kind of capacity is that, right?
And how are they linked?
And how are they linked together so that if you pick something up that that you're not looking at and you expect it to have a certain shape when you're surprised, right? Or weight, or whatever. How do all those things interact with one another? And that's two different sensory capacities, right? So much less language.
So it's really now trying to understand how language fits within the rest of our cognitive of the mind, of our cognitive apparatus.
So I mean, in a way, it's a version of modularity, except, as my colleague Dan Dennett says, if you really read the modularity book, in the end, it's an argument against modularity for anything but perception.
But you mean the classic photo book, modularity of mind, right?
It's really an argument that the really important stuff is not modular. It's a mess.
It's a mess, right?
But this is saying actually not. Maybe you can find some finite set of representational levels and different connections among them. So, for example, if they are as informationally encapsulated as Jerry says, you couldn't have reading because you need an interface from vision into phonology or something, right? If that's innate, we're in bad trouble, right? You couldn't have reading, you couldn't have sign language. So there's a problem there. But if you think in terms of different representations and the linkages between them, and you get narrow linkages and broad linkages, and those are degrees of encapsulation, if you like, or right? So I would love to see people not in linguistics, or even people in linguistics, take this up and do it from a more global perspective, because even just thinking about it for half an hour, you can come up with ways of thinking about this. Things that would fit into this story.
So maybe I'll ask you one last. It's almost been an hour, so it's been time flies, right? Another question. This is something we touched on in the car ride this morning from Philadelphia to here. human beings have language, and there's not much evidence at all that other species have it, at least currently. I mean, there are claims that people make, but I don't think they're taken very seriously by people who really study language carefully.
Right.
So what do you think that this view that you have about what language is and what it does this have any bearing on a question that has become fashionable again, which is the evolution of language? And the sort of second aspect of this is, what do you think that this gives us human beings in terms of mental power that perhaps non-human animals lack?
Well, as I said in the car, I've read, for a period I was reading very seriously all the stuff on primate cognition, right? Social cognition, spatial cognition. Actually, very early in my graduate work, for some reason I read Curler's Mentality of Apes from 1927.
Wow.
Which is about these chimps that are solving difficult problems, and you give them this problem of bananas on the ceiling, and
and they solve it creatively.
But he'll run off, and he'll jump and try to reach it and stuff, and then he'll go off in the corner and sulk for a while. And then all of a sudden he gets up, pushes the box under the banana, jumps on the box, pulls down the banana, and eats it. Right. So an
epiphany.
right. Curler says if you saw a human doing this, that you'd say they were having an insight.
Exactly right.
So why should we say in this case it's an instinct? Right.
Yeah.
So he's
it's always this.
And it was the same arguments as Chomsky makes about language, which was what impressed me so much. Right. These guys know something. We have evidence for. Here's the structure of the task, and here's. He would deconstruct these tasks and say, here's the part that chimp can do, here's the part he can't do. It looks totally obvious to us, but here's where they get screwed up. So he was doing the right kind of, and the more recent stuff.
The gap really has narrowed. Though.
Yeah.
I mean,
so
what we used to think animals can and can't do compared, say, even 20 years ago to today. But language still seems to be...
but let me finish.
But yes, please, of course.
Right, so you want to say, okay, there's thought there, so there's something you might want to express. That's sort of a motivation for inventing language, right? You don't want to say, well, language came along and then they learned to think, which seems to be Noam's view, in a way. He says it's the advent of language.
Right, it's helped think a certain way, I guess. It's helped maybe connect things, but I don't think he would deny that other creatures can think under some interpretation.
Well, that's the thing. He never cites that literature.
That's interesting. Yeah. So psychologists make this distinction that we've touched on also between sort of system 1 and system 2, right? The sort of unconscious aspects of thinking, things that happen under the hood, and the more conscious. And you've had a lot to say about this in your book. About what this might be.
So
back to animals. Then clearly they're thinking.
Well, they're thinking, and that's what got me thinking that spatial language is sort of the place to start in thinking about semantics, because that's the stuff that is available to
not
primates,
just humans,
to non-humans, right?
Yeah.
So I did all this work on spatial semantics, all this stuff on trajectories and and places, and that's spawned a nice little psycholinguistic sub-industry, right?
Absolutely.
The work I did with Barbara Landau on spatial prepositions, that kind of stuff. But to say a lot of these distinctions have to be available just to understand the physical world, to navigate around in it. And now you can say, well, okay, once you have language, are there thoughts that you cannot have unless you have language?
Right.
And now to figure that out either in principle or experimentally is an interesting problem. You can say, okay, once you have language, for example, the concept of a week is not possible unless you can count to 7. There's nothing in the natural world that corresponds to weeks. Months, yes. There's this phases of the moon, maybe, right? Or years, yes, it gets cold and then it gets hot and then it gets cold again. But a week, requires counting. And anything that requires counting seems to require language beyond the subitizing 7 or whatever it is, right?
2 or 3, I think.
Right, to get, or whatever it is.
Whatever it is today.
Whatever it is today. To get exact numbers, you need language.
Right.
Don't know what else, but now let's go out and look
and find out.
And it's something that would be interesting to do. But that comes to the system 1, system 2 distinction. So the idea behind System 2 is it's supposed to be conscious. It's supposed to be sequential and slow.
Slow. That's
Anything
right.
else?
Effortful.
Right.
Yeah. And that's about the main
Yeah.
the main ideas.
Well,
and the idea in that literature is that it's an evolutionary younger
system.
and not shared. People assume
Right.
with other
so
animals, contrary to System 1, which
right.
for the most part. As you said, it makes sense. You don't want to fall off cliffs and trees. So you kind of want to have a way
you want to get along.
And you want to get along with
other
guys, and exactly.
And you want to, you want to eat, and you want to get.
That's right.
Have sex.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So in that psychological literature, there's a strong link that people make without going into details because they're not linguists, but between System 2 and language, and they seem to assume that we kind of got System 2 somehow when we got language. And then with System 2, they say you can do all these abstract, things. You can do eventually science, and you can do, you can think about things that. So this is something that's been really of great interest to me.
Well, I think I'd agree with that view.
Yeah.
You could be more precise about it.
Right. That's right. That's exactly. And I also wonder if there's something within System 1 that language allows you to do, and not just System 2. Right? There are manifestations in System 2 for sure, but what's to say that things in System 1 can't be...
Well, the thing is that I think my impression of this literature, and I don't know very well, is that people say, well, these are really different systems. And my feeling...
But they have to talk to each other.
They
have to talk to each other.
Well, it's more than that. I mean, what I'm saying
about
here...
rationality, right? Yeah.
Well, is that System 2 is really... System 1 plus language.
Right, yes.
And that's it.
But
so, in fact, System 2 is not divorced from System 1.
Yeah.
It's really just an add-on.
Right, yes, right, exactly. That allows you to manipulate the intuitions that System 1 gives rise to, that allows you to verbally report them and share them, and therefore to elaborate on them.
Right, and also that the conscious part of System 2 is really the phonology of language.
Yeah, that's one thing I really loved about your book, because it's very counterintuitive. Because you think you have access not just to the phonological handle, as you call it, but to the actual thoughts, the meaning.
Right.
And so you have this idea about the hidden meaning hypothesis.
Yeah.
I find that extremely interesting.
And the simplest argument for that is if you're translating between languages.
Right.
It can't be the form. It's got to be something that they share in common, and you say, what is that? And all you can do is express it in language. You can't put your finger on it. You say, I just have this conviction that this is the word for snow in French or something, right?
Yeah. Well, that's one of the arguments that Steve Pinker gave in The Language Instinct for mental ease, right? The idea that, look, you're translating something.
The thing is, it's not translating, because it's not nouns and verbs. The form of thought is not nouns and verbs. It's objects and events and places. And
in mental ease, yes.
In mental
but
ease,
the fact that you're able to translate language is from one to another means that
ease,
right. Yes.
Yes.
It's got to be something other than just the.
I have problems with the term language of thought.
Oh, okay. So
which is, I mean, again, this comes from Jerry Fodor.
Yes,
being at Rutgers, I
have
to
his
ideas, but because he thinks that language of thought is like a language.
Syntactic and
that it's
compositional.
It's syntactic, but it's the thing is, for me as a linguist, the language is phonology, syntax, and semantics.
Okay, so
Okay, the language of thought doesn't have phonology.
No.
It doesn't have syntax. It is semantics. Okay, so it's a level of representation, not a linkage of multiple levels of representation. So if you want to use language in the sense formal combinatorial system, okay, fine. Yes. Okay, then there's a language of music. There's a language of chess. There's a language of baseball. Right? Right? Any combinatorial system, mathematics, is a language. But that's not what linguists mean. Right, so if we mean language made up of phonology or if it's a sign language, signs, but whatever. So if we want, so what we mean by the language of thought is the combinatorial system of meaning.
Yes.
Um,
That's the hidden part.
that's the hidden, and that's the hidden part,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
And if you want to call that mentalese,
Yeah.
but I think it's misleading unless you're very careful about it, because it sounds like Japanese, right?
But I think misleading, yes. But he was also, I think, trying to account for the fact that animals can think, and you don't need language in the sense of the system to sort of maybe phonological aspect of it to engage in thinking and thought, right?
I'm not sure that.
At least that's what Steve.
That's what Steve says.
what
That's not what
says
Fodor says.
That's not right.
Yeah.
That's a
Oh, you're
different,
talking about Steve.
I'm talking about Steve in the language
Yeah.
instinct now. Yeah.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
sort of another famous exposition of these ideas, or some of these ideas
Yeah.
at least. Yeah. Okay. All right. So with these last thoughts, Ray, I want to thank you very much for coming here, for giving us this wonderful and thought-provoking talk. At least I'll be thinking about these ideas and trying to develop some aspects of them. And thanks again for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.